Ready for a deep dive. We're really getting into it today with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow.
It's such a foundational book, isn't it?
Absolutely. It really changed the way we think about thinking.
It's interesting how Kahneman gives us this whole new language for understanding our own minds. Like, before reading it, did you ever use the term availability heuristic in everyday conversation?
I have to admit, I probably didn't.
Right. But now these terms become these handy mental tools. You start noticing biases and patterns in yourself and other people.
Like halo effect. Totally guilty of that one. But yeah, it's like he's giving this backstage pass to how our brains work, those hidden biases and all.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest aha moments is that idea of the two systems, right? System one and system two.
Yeah, it's like our brain has two different operating modes, almost like two different personalities duking it out up there.
And they really are. You have system one, which is fast, intuitive, emotional. Like, think about dodging a ball flying at your face or, instantly knowing what 2 plus 2 equals. It's all about efficiency.
Right. So our brains are wired to make quick judgments, to not overthink everything.
Exactly. And that's where those mental shortcuts come in heuristics. But the catch is, these shortcuts, as useful as they are, can sometimes lead us astray.
Because we're so focused on efficiency, we sometimes miss the bigger picture.
Exactly. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to think of words that start with the letter K.
Okay.
Got it. Now, try thinking of words with K as the third letter.
That's harder.
Way harder, right. And because it's easier to recall those words that start with K, our brains tend to assume they're more common, even though statistically, that's not true.
So we're basically making these unconscious assumptions based on what's easiest to access in our memory.
Precisely. And that's the availability heuristic in action. We judge the likelihood of something based on how easily we can think of examples.
Wow, that's such a mind bender. And I can see how this could have some real-world consequences.
It absolutely does. It influences everything from our fears and anxieties to our investment decisions. And one of the most striking examples of this in action is the invisible gorilla experiment.
Oh, yeah. The one where people are so focused on counting basketball passes that they completely miss a guy in a gorilla suit walking right through the middle of it.
Exactly. It's such an elegant experiment because it really demonstrates the limited capacity of our attention. System one, that fast, intuitive system, is so laser focused on the task at hand that system two, the more deliberate system, doesn't even kick in to override that tunnel vision.
It makes you wonder what else we're missing in our everyday lives because our attention is so preoccupied. So much for seeing is believing.
Right. It really calls into question how much we're truly perceiving and how much our brains are filling in the gaps, often without us even realizing it.
It's funny, that gorilla experiment, it really makes you think about how our brains are wired, not just to see what's in front of us, but to try to create a coherent story out of it all.
It's so true. Our brains crave that coherence, that sense of narrative. And that's a really important point because that craving, that need for a story, it actually underpins so many of the biases that Kahneman talks about.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, because our brains want that neat narrative, they often rely on whatever information is readily available, even if it's incomplete. They kind of jump to conclusions based on what they already know or think they know.
So we're filling in the blanks with assumptions.
Exactly. And that's where his whole concept of WISAT comes in. What you see is all there is.
WISAT. It's like our brains just decide this is the story and that's that.
Exactly. And we see this in every area of life, whether it's forming first impressions, making investments, even in relationships.
We do tend to make snap judgments about people based on very little information, don't we?
All the time. And those judgments aren't always accurate. And one of the most famous experiments that demonstrates this is the Linda problem. It really highlights something called the conjunction fallacy. Have you heard of this one?
The Linda problem. Yeah, it's the one where they give you a description of this woman, Linda, who's very intelligent, outspoken, passionate about social justice. And then you have to rank the probability of different statements about her, right?
Exactly. And here's the thing. Most people, even those who are really good at statistics, they fall into the trap of thinking that it's more likely that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement than simply Linda is a bank teller.
Because it just feels more plausible based on her description. But isn't that statistically less likely?
Way less likely. It's impossible, in fact, for two events happening together to be more likely than just one of those events. But our intuition, that system one thinking, gets fooled by the narrative. We've created this whole persona of Linda in our minds.
It's amazing how easily our brains can be tricked by a good story. And speaking of being tricked, What about framing? I know Kahneman talks about how the way information is presented can completely change how we perceive it, even if the underlying options are basically the same.
Oh, absolutely. Framing effects are incredibly powerful. And one of my favorite examples is the one he gives about how willing people are to drive to save money on, of all things, a calculator.
A calculator. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So imagine the calculator is $15 and you can save $5 by driving to a different store. Now imagine the calculator is $125 and you can still save $5 by driving to that other store. Are you more likely to make the drive in the first scenario or the second?
I think I'd be more likely to drive for the $5 savings when the calculator's only $15.
Exactly. And that's the power of framing. Even though it's the same $5 savings either way, that initial price, that frame of reference, completely changes how we value the savings.
So it's like our brains are wired to look for relative value rather than absolute value in these situations. It's kind of irrational when you think about it.
Totally irrational. But that's system one for you, always looking for the quickest, easiest path, even if it means bending the rules of logic a little bit.
So we've got these brains that are wired for efficiency, always looking for shortcuts, even if it means bending the rules of logic a bit. It makes you wonder, how do we make any sense of our experiences, our decisions, with all these cognitive quirks influencing us?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Because Kahneman doesn't just leave us hanging with a bunch of biases and no way to navigate them. He introduces this really compelling idea, the distinction between what he calls the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Two versions of ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more about these two selves.
So think about it this way. You're at a party, right? You're chatting with friends, enjoying the music, maybe having a delicious drink. That's your experiencing self in action, living in the moment, taking it all in.
Makes sense. We're all about the present moment when we're having a good time. But then the party's over, you go home, and you're left with these memories, these snapshots of the night. Is that where the remembering self comes in?
Exactly. The remembering self is the storyteller. It takes those moments, those experiences, and weaves them into the larger narrative of our lives. And here's the really interesting part. What our remembering self latches onto isn't always a perfectly accurate reflection of what our experiencing self actually well experienced.
So you're saying those two versions of ourselves don't always agree on how things went down?
Often they don't. And this difference in perspective, it can have a huge impact on our choices. Think about how we choose vacations, for example. We often pick destinations based on how memorable we think they'll be, how good the pictures will look, even if that means dealing with crowded airports or a jam-packed itinerary.
It's like we're always thinking about the story we'll tell later. We're almost living for the highlight reel, aren't we?
Exactly. We prioritize creating memories, sometimes at the expense of actually enjoying the present moment. And this ties directly into another one of Kahneman's big ideas, the peak end rule.
Right, the peak end rule. That's the
Yeah.
one where we tend to judge an experience based on its most intense point and how it ends, rather than the overall average of good or bad.
Right, you got it. So even if an experience has some rough patches, if it ends on a high note, our remembering self tends to gloss over those less than stellar moments.
It's like that saying, all's well that ends well. Our memories can be pretty forgiving, or at least selective, can't they?
Absolutely. And this has some pretty profound implications for how we make decisions.
So knowing all of this, knowing about our biases, our two selves, this peak end rule, what can we actually do with this information? How can we use it to make better, more conscious choices?
Well, I think a big part of it is just awareness. Recognizing that our brains have these built-in tendencies, these shortcuts, can help us take a step back and say, okay, am I seeing this situation clearly, or is my system one running the show here?
So don't just trust your gut.
Your gut's not always right. Sometimes you have to question those initial instincts, especially for big decisions. Kahneman talks about the illusion of validity, this idea that we tend to be overconfident in our own judgment, even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
We're all a little bit guilty of that, aren't we?
We are, but by recognizing it, we can start to counteract it. Engage system two. Ask for different perspectives, analyze the data, really challenge your own assumptions.
So it's almost like we need to train ourselves to be a little more skeptical, not just of the information we're getting, but of our own thinking process.
Exactly. Think about it like this. You wouldn't show up to an important meeting without doing your homework, right? You'd gather all the relevant information, think through different scenarios, be prepared for counter-arguments.
Right. Preparation is key. So we need to apply that same level of rigor to our own decision-making process, especially for the big stuff.
Exactly. And part of that preparation is understanding these cognitive biases that we've been talking about. Like, for example, when you're planning a project, be aware of the planning fallacy. We tend to underestimate how long things will take and how much they'll cost because we're naturally optimistic and focused on the ideal scenario.
So always build in a little buffer time, maybe pad the budget a bit.
Always. It's better to be pleasantly surprised than massively stressed out later on. It all comes back to that idea of thinking about thinking. The more we understand how our minds work, the better equipped we are to make choices that align with our values and goals. And that's really what Kahneman's work is all about, giving us the tools to navigate the complexities of our own minds and make more deliberate, fulfilling choices.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. Such a great reminder that there's always more to learn about ourselves and how our minds work. So next time you're facing a decision, big or small, remember to tap into that System 2 thinking. Slow down, question your assumptions, and make choices that your future self will thank you for.